All right, welcome in everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to zero in on something pretty useful for all of you out there, especially if you're in that secondary school world, grades 6 through 12, you know what I'm talking about. It's about how writing, writing, can actually supercharge your learning across like all your subjects.
You got it. And to really unpack this, we're taking a deep dive into a pretty massive research review titled Writing in the Secondary Level Disciplines, a systematic review of context, cognition, and content. I mean, these researchers didn't mess around. They went through over 3,500 articles to figure out what actually works when it comes to writing and learning.
Wow, over 3,500. That's a lot of articles, right? Talk about thorough. One of the interesting things they point out right off the bat is how literacy research has historically focused way more on reading than writing.
Yeah, for sure. And because of that, teachers in subjects like math or science or history sometimes feel like they weren't really prepared to teach writing effectively. Like, is it really their job? But this review makes this really important distinction between like general literacy skills, being able to read your textbook, and what they call disciplinary literacy. Those are the specific reading, writing, and thinking skills you need for a particular subject. Like, it's different to write up a science experiment than to write a history essay.
Totally. So it's not just putting words on a page, it's about understanding how writing works in each of these different fields. And this review really gets into the nitty-gritty of how using writing in these subject areas can make a huge difference in how well secondary students actually learn.
Exactly. And to make sense of all those thousands of articles, the researchers organized their findings into three main categories. Can you lay those out for us?
Sure thing. So they looked at context, meaning how writing tasks are actually designed and used in classrooms. Then they looked at cognition, like the actual mental processes that are happening when students write. And lastly, they dug into content, which is how writing both shows and deepens your knowledge in a particular subject.
Okay, context, cognition, content. Got it. Those are our guideposts for this deep dive. So let's start with context, like setting the stage for effective writing. And one thing that kept popping up was using pre-writing models and templates.
Yeah, one of the big takeaways here is that there's tons of evidence showing that having a structured way to plan before you write is super helpful. One approach that showed up a lot was the science writing heuristic, or SWH. They talked about it in 8 different studies.
Science reading heuristic, okay. Sounds kind of technical. What's the basic idea?
Okay, so picture a lab report, right?
Hmm.
But instead of just filling in the blanks, the SWH guides you through the whole investigation. It gives you specific questions to think about, both for you as the student and for the teacher at different points in the lab. Like, what are your initial questions? How do you collect data? How do you draw conclusions from that data? What are you reading? And how do you reflect on the whole process?
So it's a framework that actually helps you think like a scientist through the entire experiment, not just at the end when you're writing it up. And did they find that this actually helped students learn the science better?
You bet. The study showed that using the SWH actually led to higher achievement in understanding the science concepts, and not just in one way. They measured it in a bunch of different ways. It wasn't just about the report being better. They actually understood the science more deeply.
That's awesome. It shows how putting your thoughts together in writing can really make your understanding stick. What other pre-writing models did they find worked well?
Another one was argument-driven inquiry, or ADI. It's kind of similar to the SWH in that it gives you a structure for thinking through a lab experiment. But the cool thing about ADI is that it really emphasizes having students discuss and argue their ideas and actually reviewing each other's work.
Oh, that's interesting. So it adds that collaboration piece and gets students thinking critically about their classmates' work. And what were the findings with ADI?
Well, the research found that it had a really positive impact on two things: how well students could form scientific arguments and their knowledge of the actual content. And this was specifically for students in grades 7 through 11.
That makes sense. If you have to defend your ideas and critique someone else's, you have to know what you're talking about, right? Now, they didn't just focus on science, did they? What about other subjects?
Right. For history, they found this method called the historical reasoning strategy worked really well. It's basically a 4-step model for looking at historical sources. First, you think about who created the source, then you work on understanding the source itself, then you critically evaluate it, and finally, you use all that to build a deeper understanding of the historical event.
That's a pretty systematic way to go about it. And how did that strategy affect their writing?
Well, the research showed that it really helped students write stronger argumentative essays in history. Like, their arguments were better supported by evidence and things like that.
That makes sense. Okay, and for students who learn best visually, the review mentioned something called V-maps for science. What are those?
Oh yeah, VMAPs. They're basically visual organizers that help you connect the knowing part of science, like the theories and concepts, with the doing part, like experiments and data collection. The research showed that using VMAPs helps students understand both the process of science and the core concepts better. It's like a bridge between the theory and the actual practice.
So a way to make those connections more concrete. Now, with all these models, it makes me wonder, does it matter when you do this planning? Like at what point in the learning process? Or is it just important that you do plan?
That's a good question. And what's really interesting is that the review found that the specific timing of these planning tasks didn't really seem to make a huge difference. The key takeaway here is that the act of planning itself, regardless of when you do it, seems to be what really helps students learn better.
That's good to know. It really emphasizes that taking the time to organize your thoughts before you write is what's crucial. Okay, so moving beyond specific pre-writing models, another big theme in this context category was how instruction is actually delivered, especially what they call explicit strategy instruction. What's that all about?
So explicit strategy instruction is basically when you directly teach students specific techniques and approaches to help them write more effectively. They highlighted a few different methods in the review, including something called self-regulated strategy development, or SRSD.
SRSD, we might have touched on that before. Remind me, what's the main idea there?
The core idea is to give students specific steps for writing better, but also teach them how to monitor their own progress and make adjustments. It often involves breaking down a writing strategy into smaller, more manageable steps, and then teaching students how to track their own use of that strategy and become more independent as writers. The studies show that SRSD was really effective in helping students write better arguments and understand concepts across different subjects.
Got it. So it's not just giving you the tool, it's teaching you how to use it and how to become more self-sufficient, right? That connects with something you mentioned before, the inquiry-based approach to teaching.
Yeah, exactly. The review talked a lot about how teaching subjects from an inquiry-based perspective, like posing questions and investigating and building your own understanding rather than just memorizing facts, had a really positive impact on both students' content knowledge and their writing. This was especially true in science and history.
It seems like the ultimate goal of all these strategies we're talking about, like pre-writing models and explicit instruction, is to make students into more independent thinkers, right?
Absolutely. It's all about giving you the tools and the mindset to approach any writing task in a thoughtful way and become more self-directed in your learning. Okay, now let's move on to the actual writing tasks themselves. What did they find about the types of writing that work best for learning?
One of the big things they emphasized was making sure the writing task actually aligns with what you want students to learn. So, for instance, using concept mapping as a writing activity can help you engage with the material more deeply and see how different ideas connect. And in history, asking students to write something where they have to support their claims with evidence is way more effective for developing their reasoning skills than, say, just writing a creative story about the past.
So it's about being really intentional about why you're assigning a particular type of writing, right? Now, what about different genres? Like, does the format itself matter as much as what you're asking them to do?
That's interesting. The review suggested that the specific genre might actually be less important than whether students are able to consider different viewpoints and use sources effectively in their writing. It seems like it's more about the quality of their thinking and engagement than strictly following a specific format.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, now what about those classic steps in the writing process, planning and revising? We've already talked about planning quite a bit, but what about revision? How important is that for actually learning the content?
They found some interesting stuff there. While both are important, planning might actually be a little more impactful for content learning than revising, at least in some cases. Of course, revision is still super valuable for making your writing better, but that act of structuring and organizing your thoughts before you write seems to be more directly linked to understanding the material.
That really underscores the importance of those pre-writing strategies we talked about earlier. Now, last thing on context. The review looked at how often students should write. What did they find there?
Pretty clear findings on this one. The more opportunities students have to write, the better their learning outcomes and writing skills. Makes sense, right? Regularly engaging with writing helps you process information more deeply and reinforces what you're learning.
So it's not just about one big writing assignment. It's about the cumulative effect of writing consistently over time. Okay, that wraps up context. Let's move on to cognition, which is all about the thinking that goes on behind the writing. And the big theme here is this idea of metacognition. Could you break that down for us? What does it mean in this context?
Sure. Metacognition is basically thinking about your own thinking. It's being aware of how your mind works, checking your understanding, and actively managing your own learning process. And the review found a strong link between metacognition and student achievement, which matches what other research has shown.
Okay, so how can teachers actually help students develop these metacognitive strategies? And how does writing help to reveal that kind of thinking?
Teachers can do a lot to encourage metacognition, often by asking specific questions or using prompts and writing assignments that encourage students to reflect on their thinking. And you can often see this metacognitive thinking show up in their writing, especially in things like journal entries where they're reflecting on their learning process.
Speaking of journals, the review mentioned some specific things about how teachers use prompts in journals. What did they find?
Well, they found that when teachers used more specific prompts in journals, it led to students producing much more high-quality reflections on their own thinking, especially in math. So instead of just saying, write about what you learned today, a more specific prompt might be, what strategies did you try when you were solving this problem, and why do you think some of them worked better than others?
Yeah, that makes sense. Having that more focused prompt can really help students go deeper in their thinking. We also saw this science writing heuristic pop up again here in the context of metacognition. How does that model promote this kind of thinking?
Well, the SWH is designed in a way that really encourages metacognition. It asks you to ask questions, back up your claims with evidence, and reflect on your learning throughout the lab process. All of that pushes you to be more aware of your own thinking and how your understanding is developing.
So the structure of the SWH naturally builds in that self-awareness. The review also talked about using metacognitive journaling. What benefits did they find were linked to that?
A bunch of studies found that keeping a journal where you reflect on your learning regularly can actually help you improve both your formal writing skills and your scores on tests in different subjects like biology and psychology. It makes sense, right? By regularly thinking about your learning process through writing, you can figure out what's confusing you, make your understanding more solid, and develop better learning strategies.
It's like taking your internal thought process and making it visible so you can actually work on it. Okay, now here's a really interesting one. They looked at how changing the audience for a writing task can affect learning. Like, how does explaining something to different people change your understanding?
The research found that when students had to explain concepts to someone younger than them, compared to explaining it to an adult, it actually increased their metacognitive activity. And the reason is, when you're trying to explain something to someone who doesn't know as much, you have to think much more carefully about the main ideas, anticipate where they might get confused, and structure your explanation more clearly. And that deeper level of processing leads to better learning for the person doing the explaining.
That makes sense. You have to really know your stuff to teach it to someone else.
Right.
And you mentioned that journals are often used to both encourage and assess metacognition. What kinds of journal prompts seem to work best for that?
The review pointed out that the most effective prompts were the ones that focused on specific parts of the material. So, for example, asking students to analyze why a character in a book made a certain decision, or to identify a central theme and explain how it develops, that kind of thing. The more targeted the prompt, the better the reflection tended to be.
So not just general journaling, but really specific, focused questions. Okay, last thing in the cognition category, the review talked about how content area writing tasks can actually help boost your talking and reasoning skills. What's the connection there?
Some studies found that having discussions before writing can be really helpful. Like, one study found that when students both talked about and wrote about a math topic, they did better than students who only did one or the other. Another study in Science found that students who usually struggled benefited a lot from discussing their ideas out loud before writing explanations. So yeah, talking about your ideas first can help you organize your thoughts before you try to write them down.
That makes total sense. It's like a rehearsal for writing, especially for students who have trouble getting started. So this whole cognition section really emphasizes that writing isn't just about the final product. It's a powerful tool for shaping how we think.
For sure. It highlights how important it is to be aware of your own thinking and how well-designed writing tasks can help you do that and ultimately learn better.
Okay, on to our last category, content. This is all about how writing helps reveal subject-specific learning And the big theme here seems to be achievement.
Yep, achievement was a focus across many of the studies. But some research specifically zoomed in on how writing itself can be used to measure and demonstrate what students have learned in a subject.
Interesting. So how did they do that? What kinds of writing tasks were good at showing what students knew?
Well, one thing they highlighted was that tasks involving critical reasoning and writing had a positive impact on students' understanding of real-world science issues. It wasn't just about recalling facts, but about applying scientific thinking to complex situations. They also found that assessments that included more writing actually revealed students' scientific understanding more effectively than traditional multiple-choice tests.
So asking students to explain their reasoning in writing gives you a much clearer picture of what they really understand. What about other subjects, like history?
The review mentioned that teaching students to analyze and interpret historical sources led to better performance on those document-based questions, the essay questions, where you have to work with primary sources.
So when the teaching focuses on deeper engagement and the writing tasks reflect that, students are better equipped to show what they know. The review also talked about using writing for formative assessment, which is basically using student work to help guide your teaching.
Right. That's a really valuable use of writing. Several studies showed how looking at students' written responses could directly inform how teachers approached writing instruction, especially in history and science. By seeing where students struggled in their writing, teachers could figure out what areas needed more specific instruction or where they needed to tweak their teaching methods.
So student writing becomes a feedback tool for teachers to help them target their instruction more effectively. Now, they also mentioned engaging students in the disciplinary conversation. What's that about?
That's about helping students understand how experts in a field communicate and think. Like in science, it might involve having them write about those big socioscientific issues like climate change or GMOs. Research found that when students wrote about these topics, their own values played a big role in how they reasoned and used scientific knowledge in their arguments.
That's fascinating. It brings in real-world connections and acknowledges how students' personal perspectives can shape their understanding. The review also mentioned how writing in science can help connect knowledge from different subjects.
Exactly. When students write about complex scientific issues, they often have to draw on knowledge from other areas, like health or even social studies. This process of connecting different subjects in their writing helps to deepen their overall understanding.
And what about those specific qualities that make writing effective in a particular discipline?
The review highlighted some research that actually defined the key characteristics of good writing in history. Things like building an argument, providing historical context, using evidence effectively, accuracy, and understanding how to use and evaluate sources. In science, they talked about the difference between writing to explain a concept versus writing to describe a procedure and how it's important for students to be able to do both.
Right, so understanding what good writing looks like in each subject is key. Finally, the content category touched on the different types of understanding that writing can reveal and also some of the limitations of what writing can do. What can you tell us about that?
One study in physics, for example, found that while writing could help students understand the concepts better, it didn't necessarily translate to being better at solving numerical problems. That suggests that writing might be more effective for some types of learning than others. Another study in the humanities found that having students try different types of writing, like storytelling or descriptive writing, could actually help them develop the foundational understanding they needed for more complex analytical writing later on.
So it's about understanding that writing is a versatile tool and that different types of writing serve different purposes, and also being realistic about what writing can and can't do.
Right. It's a powerful tool, but not a magic bullet. It works best when it's used strategically and with effective teaching.
This has been a really thorough overview of the review's findings. So to sum it all up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners today?
I'd say the big message is this. When writing tasks are thoughtfully designed and integrated into learning, when they really engage students' thinking, and when they're aligned with the learning goals of a specific subject, they can significantly improve learning for students across all sorts of subjects and learning styles. Writing is not just an extra thing to do, it's a fundamental way to learn and understand more deeply.
Absolutely. This deep dive really gives us a solid understanding of how writing is a powerful tool for learning in any subject. So here's a final thought for you. How might you use this knowledge in your own learning or how you engage with information? Think about the power of writing down your thoughts to really solidify what you know. Which of these strategies, from planning your writing beforehand to reflecting in a journal, stood out to you, maybe even surprised you?
We encourage you to explore some of these strategies in your own learning. You might be surprised at the impact it has.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.